Start recording. Hello everyone and welcome to Handmade Hero, the show where we code a complete game live on Twitch with no libraries, no engine, no nothing really, just our own code. And we are right in the middle of doing our sort of engine design work. We are designing our own engine here. We kind of have some of the parts that we need spec'd out so far, kind of prototype in place, but we haven't really tackled some of the entity stuff that we need to get sorted out before we start working on things like the renderer or the animation system. And so what I want to do is today I'm kind of going to go through and start to play with entities a little bit. We don't have anything specific in mind, but we just want to kind of start playing with them and see what sorts of stuff we need in the entities to make them work properly and to allow us to build worlds the way that we want to build them, and just try to get a feel for what's going to be required, because that'll kind of inform our design decisions as we go forward and let us know what the engine actually needs to do in terms of supporting the stuff that we're going to want. And so we're just going to start playing around with that and we'll see where it goes. I suspect this will take us several days because we'll want to build lots of different like sort of example test sort of things in here. And we kind of have to see how each of them plays out before we can really start to make decisions about what we want the engine to do for us. Because if we just do one or two different types of entities, we'll probably miss some things that are important to some other types of entities that work different ways and that sort of stuff. In addition, kind of all wrapped up in this, we also kind of have one other small decision to make, which is if everything is an entity or if there's going to be other things that are not quite full status citizens, like that aren't all the way entities. And that sort of stuff, like, you know, do we want the grasses and the rocks on the ground to be entities? Or is it too expensive to store them as entities, and are we going to need some sort of intermediate representation for those guys that's halfway, you know, sort of lesser than an entity, if you will. So that's what we're going to do today. If you have pre-ordered the game on handmadehero.org using the pre-order button, then you should have gotten a link in your email which has basically a download page. That download page allows you to download the source code, and that source code consists of a series of zip files. What you want to do is you want to grab a day 58 zip file, because here on day 59, that's the source code that we are starting from. So grab day 58 zip file, unzip it to a directory, and you'll be exactly where I am right now. And where am I right now is always the first question of the day. And where am I right now is we had just finished our spatial partition for entities. We had thrown some trees in there. And of course, we are not actually sorting our entities yet, so we get some sort of nonsensical results, which is like, obviously, intuitively, this tree should occlude, you know, the player, but it doesn't. Similarly, like, there's places where the player looks like he should be occluded, so he should occlude a tree, but doesn't, like right there, right? And that's really a rendering thing, so I'm not sure if I actually care about that too much, but we might want to address that again as well sometime soon, which is basically just a sort of our entities in terms of what order they should be drawn in, just to fix that. So I don't know, that's kind of on the table as something that may happen when I get too annoyed with it. We know what needs to be done, it's not a big deal, but just when we do it, if it starts to make me too grumpy, then that's, you know, it's gotta be fixed before I can go do things that might be more important to do at any given time. Okay, so I guess some things just to start with, just really some basic stuff. What I'd like to do is just start playing with dropping some more entities in here. Maybe what I'll do, trying to think of what the smartest way to approach it is. Maybe what I'll do is like write some simple things like just put in another entity, another copy of the player, for example, who just kind of follows the player around. So, you know, when the player goes somewhere, that other entity will follow the player around. Because that's going to be a reasonable amount of code. That may take us several days to do, actually, to work out exactly how we want to store stuff like that. Because, for example, we may find that we want to do like pathfinding or something. Like we may want to do something like when I come up around here, you know, and the entity is over here, we may want him to be smart enough to like find this opening in the trees and walk through it, as opposed to just like bumping into the trees stupidly or something like this, right? So that's a good example of that. And similarly, with that same code, at the same time, I'll probably bring up some kind of monster, so something that like attacks the player, for example. And maybe give the player like a hit animation, like not a hit animation, but like a hit key, so he can swipe, you know, at the monster. And we'll just try to get something like that going. So we'll have you know, the player, a familiar, a monster, and the ability for them to interact in some way. And that'll kind of allow me to sort of start to see what I want in terms of systems that will allow me to construct those things without having to worry a super lot about what's going on, right? Without having to worry about like the integration effort or whatever that's required in it. So let's think about this. Let's think about how we want to do this. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and load up the editor here. Like I said, this should be relatively complicated because I'm imagining that we want something, once we start to actually want real features, like the things not to be totally stupid, it's going to get relatively complicated. Okay. So I guess what I'd like to do now is I'd like to say that you know, we're gonna put down maybe a monster in that first room, let's say, just as a test. I'll put down you know, the monster and the familiar will both go in that first room. So what we could use the new camera position, right? We could use that new camera position as a way of figuring out where those guys should go. And then I also obviously already have in here sort of, we had a very simple concept of what an entity was, right? We had heroes and we had walls. That's all we had so far. But I could go ahead in here and add an entity type that's just our test familiar, right? And I could add another entity type that was like our test monster, right? That would be pretty reasonable to do. And now, if I want to, I can go ahead and add as low entity types, right? I can go ahead and add those in using our add low entity function. So if I want to, I could make a function here that adds one of these guys. So if I add a monster, right, I can go ahead and do that. And the monster, I guess, will just continue the sort of the trend that we had been doing, where I take tile locations, right? And we add things at those tile locations, because that seems, you know, as good at anything at this point. When we start to get more into like how we want to build the world, we may change that, but for now it seems totally fine. So all I got to do here is, I guess, do exactly what I was doing, where I get out the entity stuff. What I'm wondering here is if this can't be collapsed a little bit. Like, I might as well just get the low entity directly after I do it. Do any people typically use the entity index? I guess they do sometimes. They kind of need to know that. I wonder if add low entity, though, should just return both. I guess what I'm thinking is add low entity maybe should just have a low entity, you know, something like this, new low entity, right, or something like that. And it just has, or I guess I could call it add low entity result, a little more consistent naming with what we had before. And that'll just have whatever its index was, its low index, and also its pointer. So the entity low, right? Or maybe I'll just call that low. So I could do something like that. Maybe that makes a little bit more sense to me, because then I can put this in here, and that way when you call this, it's just a little more convenient, right? So the result, right, is going to start out, I guess, let's see here, the entity index, we're always asserting that it's actually valid, so to some degree that's relatively straightforward. I guess I could even do it down here. So I could say the result dot low equals entity low, right? And let's see here. I'm kind of feeling cramped with my typing. There we go. And then my result dot low index is going to be entity index, like so. So if I go ahead and return that instead, now all of these people who get both things can just do it in one go, and they don't have to constantly be doing all this nonsense. And so we can just do it this way, I suppose. Oops, just do it this way, where we do that. And now we don't have to call that anymore, and this is just entity dot low, and this is entity dot low index, like so. And that can go ahead and return. You know, it could even return just this, although for now I guess I won't do that. We'll see if anyone actually uses that in that way. In fact, I guess I could check right now to see what they're doing. Yeah, it doesn't look like they actually use it. So for now we'll just leave it that way, but it could be something easy to do, is just pass this on, right? Pass it on as we go. And that sort of seems a little compelling. Anyway, so now if I'm going to do this, instead of doing these two things, I'll just do this right here, right, like that. And this will add an entity type monster, and it'll add it at that location. Now, I don't actually know what the entity monster's height and width should be. I guess I'll just use the same as we were using for the player for now. And they will collide for now too, because I feel like that just makes sense. And I guess maybe we'll start the trend. What the hell? let's go ahead and start the trend where we go ahead and return the entity as it was, like that. And this will be add low entity result. So that'll be, oops, that will be just returning that. And same thing with the wall. That'll do it this way. And that'll return that entity here. Oops, entity, whatever that is. And there we go with this. Okay, so that'll go away, and these will become dots. So, and let's take a look if there's anything else we have to fix there. Oops, gotta fix that. Oops, that's no good. There we go. And add player is could just get low index directly off of it, and so that's done. And this is all good now. All right, so that's all good. And we should go ahead and add one of our monsters now, because we can. So when we add this in, I guess what we would do is say, oh, I don't know. We know that this is where the camera is. So I guess what I'll say, I'll do something like camera tile X, like this. Camera tile Y, like this. And camera tile Z. There you go. Camera tile X, camera tile Y, and camera tile Z, like so. And so that way, if I want to do an add monster, I can just kind of put him somewhere near the camera, you know, plus something, right? I can just do him like camera tile Y +2, +2, or something like that, right? Something relatively simple. And that will, I believe, take one of those. So that will add our monster to the world. I think this actually takes that. There we go. So if I run this, I feel like, yeah, I get that. Now, okay, I'm not sure, though. That seems a little bit busted. I don't understand why. That is what I expected him to be a tree, because that's the only other thing we draw right now. So we have to go add the ability to draw monsters as different things. But why did he only appear? Oh, duh. I know why. Again, set camera is, of course, the thing that actually does the work. If you never call set camera, then low entities can't be brought in to the set. And I wonder if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I don't really know. We might have to think about that a little bit. Like, when we add something, do we need to then check to see if it's inside the camera bounds to know whether maybe at the time we added it, it should be added into the system, right? And I don't know. That's like a pretty difficult question to answer, actually. So, you know, maybe I'll go into add low entity and just say to do we need to have a begin end paradigm for adding entities so that they can be brought into the high set when they are added and are in the camera region, right? So you understand what was happening there, right? Basically what happened is I do that one set camera call at the end to sort of set things up, and that's what brings everything into the high entity set. Until there is a player on the screen, set camera will never be called again because the camera hasn't moved. And so until I hit the spacebar and actually make a player that will start causing set camera to get called, there's no reason why that guy will ever come on the screen, right? And so until I actually have the player, that's the only thing that will bring him on. So now that should be fixed because I believe I moved him below the set camera. Did I? Yes. So now it should actually, yeah, be there the whole time, which it is. So that's what we want, but again, just something to be aware of. Not sure if we really care too much about that. It's easy to fix, but I'm not sure what our paradigm, like I said, is going to be for that exactly. So yeah, so that's about it. Okay. Moving on. I guess what I would say is we might as well try drawing this as something a little more recognizable. And so we kind of just we don't have any sort of rhyme or reason to how we're drawing things, and I don't necessarily know that we want to address that now because I feel like we want to address that kind of more when we start working with animation. So what I might do is just the most basic thing here, which is switch on the low entity type, and then go ahead and check to see what actually is the type. Draw each one different. So we've got entity type wall. That will be drawn the way that we were drawing it, as this, like so. And then the other thing we can do is go ahead and do an entity type monstar, and monstar will, have something else. I don't know that we care about the default case, where if we don't know what it is, normally I assert on something like that, but in this case, well, in this case, maybe I'll assert on it as well. So we'll do an assertion here where we'll just say invalid code path, right? So basically, if we get to here, we know that we forgot one of our entity types. And I won't put in entity type null as well, so that'll remind us if we're accidentally looping over and drawing the null entity. But so now if we get to monstar, we need to draw something. I think what I'll probably do is maybe just draw, like something like the hero bitmap. Let's do maybe just the torso, right? Like so. And we also had a familiar, did we not? Entity type familiar, right? And the entity type familiar, I think we'll just draw just maybe the head, like so. So we'll go ahead and try that out. And again, this code is just totally garbage placeholder code. So as long as it works at all, I'm totally fine with it. We'll go ahead and do that there. So at that point, we should be, and in fact, I could pull this out for now because people are using it in general, even though obviously not everyone will look up into hero bitmaps, just for our own convenience. So that should give us a monstar. That's just a little, that's like a little, it's just a little torso with no arms and legs. What are you going to do? It's a monster. And I suppose we could also put a shadow in there for that guy while we're at it. So maybe these guys both get shadows. And we have our add monster. So we'll also do an add familiar. And the add familiar is a little bit weird because I'm not sure if the add familiar should collide or if the add familiar is kind of a floating thing, which doesn't really have to collide. So maybe the familiar can just do whatever it wants for now. Just for now. Eventually, maybe not. I think we probably want the concept of flying versus on the ground, and so that it would still collide with things that were full height, but it could float over things like, that were whatever. You know what I'm talking about. Standard gamey sorts of stuff, right? You know what I mean. So that, to me, looks relatively good with add familiar. I don't think I really need to do much else with it, like so. And so we can add the monster and we can add the familiar, and then we will have both of those on the screen at the same time, which is always good. And we'll put this one kind of on the opposite side. And now they should both be there, and there they are. So now what we need to do is we have controller logic in there so that we can move ourselves around, right? And you can see I'm not colliding with this guy because we set his collide to false, but I am colliding with this guy because we set his collide to true, so that's good. What I need to do is set up some kind of a notion of when these people think about what they want to do, right? Because we don't need to think about what the player does really, because we just use whatever the keyboard input or the joystick input is, and that allows us to just, know exactly how we should be updating the player. But we now need some way of taking high entities that are not the player and updating them, right? So what we want to do is put in that structure. And then what we'll do, I guess, is for our familiar, we'll kind of have a notion that maybe the familiar follows anything nearby that's a player, and if it gets too far away, it stops following or something like that. I don't know if we want them to be permanently tagged to a particular player or not, but we'll see. And then the monstar will do similarly. If it sees a hero nearby, it will try to start attacking it. Maybe we'll give it a projectile or something. I don't know exactly what it will do. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. I guess we can leave the code running for now. And so the way we would do that is we already have the concept in our code here of looping over the controllers, right, and moving the player. So then what we would need is something where we actually go and loop over the high-level entities, and for every high-level entity, we like update its position, right? Now, I don't know exactly what we want to do in terms of the order of operations here. It's a little confusing because what I could do is I could do the update and the render for those high-level entities in one pass, really. And by the way, we can get rid of this entirely now. We don't even have a tile map to draw anymore, so that can go away. So when we update our high-level entities, and we've already got their high and low state here, I don't know, it might be fine to just go ahead and right here do that update. Now, entity offset for frame, I thought we stopped using that. What is that even doing here? That's just, yeah, that's just leftover code, right? We're now doing that offset in the set camera call. So if we go ahead and just say, like, let's start by just putting it here because we already have one loop over everyone and we've already pulled them in. So now would be a good place to do it. Let's say that we want to, let's say that we just want this to be our code where we update the entity. So let's go ahead and update this entity here. We'll pass the high entity and the low entity. And I believe we already have a structure for this, though, don't we? We've got this, essentially. So what I'll do is I'll just say entity, and that entity will have its low index equal to whatever the low index was, which is that. The entity's low pointer will be the low entity, and the entity high will be the high entity, like so. And then we can just go ahead and update that, right? So we'll update that. We know what our DT is, right? We pass it the game world as well. So we're going to update the entity there, and we're going to update them by this amount. So that's the amount of time that has elapsed. And that seems reasonable, right? So we'll start with that. Seems plausible. So basically, this just has to take an entity, and it has to actually do its update. Now, you know what, though? Thinking about this a little bit further, I actually already am checking its type, too, to render it. So if I wanted to, I could use this. I could collapse this dispatch in sort of a more... I could probably make this a little bit smarter already, actually. So maybe we'll go ahead and do that. Let's take a look at what's going on here. First of all, this... first of all, this jump code. I don't know what to do with this jump code that we threw in there in a Q&A one day. This is not particularly great. So let's go ahead and see what's going on here. So we've got player RGB. Those are not even being used anymore at all. We can get rid of those for now. We have what the ground point is of this particular entity. That is not something that actually matters per entity at all. That's the same computation for everybody. So we could sort of consider that to be something that's trivial to compute. That's kind of just transforming into that space. We've got the Z is done, the standard way the Z was done. And then this is really just computing for the rectangle, which is only drawn in like debug scenarios, right? So I think what I might do is start to pull this out into some more, like slightly more logical things. So let's take a look here. Hold on a second. I want to clean this up a little bit before we go any further. Let's see, we're still doing everything right over here, yeah. So the first thing I want to do is say, well, I don't think this jump code really belongs here at all, obviously. I don't know why it's even here. It's updating the equations of motion for this guy's Z, but really if it was going to do that, it should probably be in some kind of... now that I think about it, I guess if everyone's under the influence of gravity, I suppose that's fine. This is actually all right. I mean, everyone could have their DZ updated with gravity. I mean, gravity applies to everybody. All right. Well, you know what? I guess I changed my mind. We'll let it stay on there. So we'll call this shadow alpha, and we'll just go ahead and leave that on there. I mean, if it works, it works. You know, don't kill it. So basically, this is just how we would update the Z for the guy after we already did his regular updating. And I suppose that that could be baked into whatever equations of motion update we do. So maybe I could just have sort of a universal equations of motion update happen in here for anyone who actually wants it. So I'd pull out the collision detection stuff, and that would kind of come in here, and then we just have that happen, and the Z would be rolled into it. Seems reasonable. Guess I don't see a real overwhelming reason why not to do it. And so, yeah, I guess we could actually do that. And similarly, I could kind of make these things queue up a little bit. I could say whatever you want to draw. You just kind of say where those things were relative to you, and then we'll draw them. Okay, all right, let's go with that. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to collapse these two things down. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say that we've got some kind of a rendering concept here. So I'm going to say that we've got something like, you know, something like this. I'm going to call it a rendered piece or something, or an entity piece, right? I don't know, entity visible piece. I don't know. I have no idea what that aim of this should be. But for right now, it doesn't really matter. And essentially what that's going to be is it's going to be a piece of information that tells us exactly what I would draw offset from some magical point, like the player's ground location, right? And so what I'll do is I'll say, here is that bitmap. Here are the offsets for it. So this is like a dx, I guess I should say offset like this. And we really need to put in some three-dimensional vectors. It's getting long in the tooth. And then we'll also say what the alpha was for it. So, you know, we got this entity visible piece. And then I'll just make a really simple little stack here, which just says pieces, right? And we'll say that, I don't know, things have 8 pieces for now. This is, again, totally random. No real concern for it. And we'll just say piece count, like so. And then for each one of these guys, as we go, and in fact, I guess I could go one step further and say entity visible piece group, like this. And that will actually just be these. There we go. Oops, not quite. OK. And so for every one of those that we have, entity visible piece group, this is our piece group. When we come in here, I will just change our draw bitmap calls to something that's essentially add piece, right? So we're going to add a piece, and each one of these things will be an add piece call. And then at the end, we'll just loop over them, right, like so, and we'll draw them. OK. And what this will let me do is this will let me kind of split those out, and so that the update call can kind of decide where it wants its stuff. And then at the end, it kind of gets collapsed down. And so that way we only have one piece of logic for each entity that both does the updating and the rendering, which, I don't know, like I said, feels like a little bit better to me at the time, but we'll see. It may end up being not what we want, and we'll rip it back out. So let's see. So we've got our piece group here, and it's got a count. I guess I shouldn't bother saying piece count, because we know that's what that is. So we've got our count, and we can loop over it for each one of the pieces in it, which is here. I will grab that piece out like so, piece index, there we go. And here's my piece group, like that. And in here, I can now say, all right, what were the things that I needed? We've got the buffer, we've got the bitmap that we need. We know this is going to be, oops, not bitmap torso, just bitmap. We know that we've got essentially wherever the thing was, so we've got these things, right? Whatever these are, we'll compute those after the fact down here, right? And that will be our piece. This is our offset x, oops, like so. This is our piece offset y. Yeah, and it's also plus the piece offset z, like so. And then in there, we need to bake in that offset by what the actual ground point is. So this is the entity ground point here, x and y. And we will go ahead and put those in there. And again, these are some pretty good candidates for vectorizing. Haven't really done it yet, but really we should probably switch to 3D. It's on my list of things to do. When we do the animation system, I think I'm kind of putting it off because we didn't really have to do it, but that'll be sort of when that has to happen. All right, and so we also need alignment on there as well. So these offsets, I guess the offsets can just bake in the alignment, now that I think about it, actually. So yeah. So why were we placing... So yeah, if I think about this a little bit more carefully, we kind of have two things. You want to collapse them both down. We have the alignment, but the alignment can be collapsed down into the offset. If we're placing something, we don't need to have two different ways to place it, right? And so we've really got two competing things. There's how you would want to move it relative to where you are, and then there's like how the bitmap was aligned separate from where you're sort of hotspotting it, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and say, let's take a look at that draw bitmap call, because all it's doing is subtracting those numbers out, right? So maybe what I want to do is just eliminate that concept now and say that that's going to be tracked a little bit higher up, just one level back, basically. Just get rid of that and say we're no longer doing that. That happens at a slightly higher level to draw bitmap. And that way, when we pass it down, we've just passed it down those things preordained. So that seems a little smarter to me. That seems to be a more logical thing for us to do. Okay, and then obviously we have to do our piece alpha as well. All right, so we've got our entity ground points there. We've got the z, which is going to be however high he is according to his thing there, and that's fine. So that actually would go in here, I guess, as well. That would be concatenated on there. Whatever we said was the entity z, I guess. Something like this, right? And the player left top and the entity width height are really for debugging only. So for right now, we don't actually need those, but we might want to leave those in there because if we want to start drawing rectangles here to show like as a debug situation where somebody is, maybe those come back into play. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do a push piece call. Those of you who know me know I like a good push. Like a good push call. I'm a pusher. It's true. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And so these are just going to basically push pieces onto this little piece stack, right? It's kind of like a piece pipe, but it's a piece stack in this case. And nobody is getting high off of it. So what we will do now is go ahead and make sure that we eliminate any of the things that we had before that were not necessary. So we really don't need, so basically this is just always zeros. We don't have any offsets that we need to apply to our dude at all. In this particular case, we only have the alignment, and that should be it, right? Because we don't have different pieces like hands or floating odd parts that attach. Everything was actually right at the origin, and then we have the alignment from the bitmap, which we pass along, and then we have the shadow alpha. Now what we could do here too is really this should be an x, y, and a z, so this should really be, one of these, right? So this should be one of those. There we go. And so on. So these are the pieces that he would want. Similarly, we come down here. We can get rid of this as well. We'll put this down here with this guy, like that. So, oops, got to get out from behind my head. And so, yeah, that's about all I really wanted to do here. This is, again, just a 0, 0, and a 0, and then it takes the 40, 80. Those could probably be wrapped up as V2s as well now. I think that would probably be reasonable, right? So maybe we'll do that next. Let's see. To do alignments as V2, right? In fact, I could go ahead and just do that directly. Let's just go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and say, let's do that. So this will take a V2 4080, like that. And these guys, I'll just have the hero bitmaps. We'll just collapse those down into a line, like so. And that'll be that. So that all looks good. Piece group, again, like this. And let's go ahead and put in the standard unused stuff. Then we've got our hero bitmaps. Oops, that's no good. Hero bitmaps align. And there's that shadow alpha. Okay, so yeah, again, not really doing anything particularly interesting here, just rote transformation of the code so that it's just a little bit easier for me to manage what's going on. And these are all push piece calls, push piece, push piece, push piece, oops, push piece, push piece, lovely. And then these are just, probably should have done this with the macro. Was too lazy to think it through. It's true. I admit that. Okay, so that's all the stuff that we need there, but now we need to go fix sort of our bitmap, our loaded bitmap. If you remember, I just said I wanted to change the alignment to actually being V2, so we're going to go ahead and say that that's a V2 now, which means we'll have to actually fix the align here to be looking like this. There we go. So that's that. And I guess these are all the same, huh? So I could just do this. All right. Shadow alpha is this value here, right? Shadow alpha. And of course, that's a little confusing because that one you really kind of want to know what it would actually be a little later on. So it's kind of like a deferred rendering thing that we're doing here. So I'm not sure. That may have been a little bit of a mistake. We'll have to think about how we want to kind of think that through. Because after we do the update, yeah, I mean, we could... it's so hard to say. So you see what my dilemma is. I'm thinking now that maybe I didn't really need to do that, because what I should possibly have done is just made a call that's like, okay, update my equations of motion, and you just call it here, instead of trying to make it so that you put the logic in here and then the stuff executes outside. Did I make a mistake? Is it possible that we just don't need this extra? Because what I was doing was essentially deferring the rendering to later so that we could do some stuff in between it. But what I was really realizing is I could just put it in here directly. Well, I'll keep going down this path. I just want to see. Maybe it does make some things a little easier later. We'll find out. But for right now, I guess I should just finish what I did, because then at least I'll be able to see if it was smart or if it was stupid in a little more detail. So I think I did just about everything except for push piece. So I just got to go implement push piece, and that's it, right? So push piece is up here. Either way, I'm glad we changed to V2s on the alignment, so that's a good thing, either way. But we just may not have needed to do this push piece bit. That may have just been unnecessary. So there's the group, right? Here's the loaded bitmap. There's the bitmap we're going to use. Here is the offset. Here's the offset Z. And here is the alignment. So what we're going to do now is we're going to, again, just make sure that we've got room for this guy. So we'll make sure that the group piece count is less than the space that we have so that we're not going to overflow it. And then we'll go ahead and stick it onto the end of that guy, right? And so here is our entity visible piece, like so. We can inline this guy so it can kind of fold away. So here's our piece, and then we will, I guess, just fill these out. There doesn't seem to be anything particularly tricky about that. So there's our offset minus the alignment, again, because we're folding those into one variable. So there's our offset Z, and then our alpha is our alpha, which we still need to put on as a default parameter since only some people pass it. Oh, I guess we don't really need to return anything. That's just a void. And that's it. So let's see. That's just count. I guess I really wanted to call it piece count. So maybe if I really wanted to call it piece count so badly, I was right the first time when I called it piece count. So let's go ahead and just change it in the other place. Let's see. Cannot convert argument 1. Yes, that's because it's not pointing to the buffer anymore. There we go. And there is our piece count that we said we were going to do. And then we also have, let's see here, 32 piece index. And it's less than piece group dot piece count. What are you saying? Piece potentially undersized local variable. Oh, right. And we need to obviously set this guy's piece count at startup to be 0. Thank you, compiler. That was handy. Oops. What did I didn't I didn't remember I still had the game running, and we changed the layout of things there. That was not my intention, but I forgot. All right. So let's see here. Piece count is 8. How is that possible? What did I... Oh, you know why? I put that in the wrong place. Meant to put it here each time. So basically, it's every entity just has its own. Yeah, like the assert caught that there. All right, so now we're doing the exact same thing we were doing, nothing special, but we've now got it into that sort of bucketed form. And so now what I can do is I can start to pull this apart a little bit more cleanly here. So what I could do is start updating these guys actually in here. Now walls don't need any update. Familiars do need an update, so there'd be an update familiar call, right, like this, and monster. So we'll have an update monster call, where I'll go ahead and call out to something that does a bunch of logic for those guys. And again, that'll just take the entity that we prepared and the game state. And I guess it also probably wants that DT, huh? So we'll call that, and we'll have our update monster call as well. And then we can actually start implementing some code that those guys use. Now, this code right here really wants to get executed later, right? And that's why I was saying that the shadow alpha is a bit of a problem, because the shadow alpha really wants to be computed after we figure out what the actual z is. And so that was a little bit of a mistake. That was the thing that I was starting to think that maybe this was wrong, because really what we should be doing is just making a utility function that computes these things, and then you still do the draw call. I don't really know. It's a good question. And one that I'm not super prepared to answer. What we can do for now is compute our shadow alpha incorrectly. So what I could do is say, oh, okay, you know, what we'll do is we'll make that be something that happens up here, right? So I'll just do like to do, this is incorrect, should be computed after update, or something like that, and we'll kind of think about that. But again, this is exactly why I'm doing this now, is because I kind of want to see where and why various things should be happening. All right, so if we want to make these functions now as just sort of some test functions that we can do, what I could do again is just make it so that it moves like towards the closest player or something like this, just something real simple, just to see what happens, and we'll go from there, right? So here's our update familiar call, here's our update monster call, so we should still compile presumably. Looks like I don't have DT anymore. Where is my DT? There it is. So got to put that up at the top. There we go. And now our things are getting updated, but they just don't have any update logic of interest, right? And so, you know, let's give them some update logic of interest. Let's go ahead and say that we want to try and find that familiar. And this is the part, we want to try and find a hero that's nearby. This is the part that I was saying kind of wants to have a spatial partition for our high entities instead of our low entities at this point. Because if this guy's in the high entity set, then when we kind of go loop over, we'd have to loop over all of our high entities, which just seems like it's entering into a bad n squared kind of situation, right? And so this is the other place that I was saying we kind of want a spatial partition for our high entities as well. But we'll see. We'll see for now. So we're going to go ahead and do the n squared route. We're going to say, let's loop over all the high entities in the game state, looking for somebody who is a hero, right? So what we're going to do is say, all right, I've got some test entity here, high entity star test entity. or I guess I should say test high entity. What's the, we should have a way, and I don't know if we actually do, right? Get high entity, we kind of need the opposite thing here, which is the thing that chases, yeah, so like this function is lousy, right? Because what that really does is that brings a guy into the high entity set. So it's really a force load to high kind of a thing, if that makes sense. This is really the wrong name. This is really, get high entity is really force entity into high or something like that, right? Does that make sense? I don't know if that makes any sense, but you see what I'm saying, right? It's like forcing a low entity into the high set, which is not the same thing. Whereas here, what we might want to do is, it would be nice if we had an easy way of saying to like get both, right? And I guess what I could do is I could say, all right, entity test entity equals you know entity from high index, like this. There we go. That seems like a reasonable way to say it. Entity from high index, and then I go ahead and say that. And that gets me back both, because since I know it's a high, I know I'll get back both entities always, because there's always the low as well. All right, so if I'm doing that, then I can go ahead and test here. I can say if the test entity type, right, is a hero type, this. If the test entity load type is a hero type, then I know that I want to follow it, I guess. I want to take a look. So maybe I'll look for whichever one's closest. So I'll say, you know, closest hero D or something like this. And I'll have, right, closest hero. And so what I'll do is I'll say the closest hero distance is going to be equal to some maximum search radius that I don't want to look outside of, right? And so maybe, you know, I am looking in a 10-meter radius or something like this. So if somebody goes, if it's outside of 10 meters, I don't look anymore, something like that, right? So that's the maximum radius, you know, 10-meter maximum search or something like that. So we go through here and we say, I want to be able to compute the distance between these two. Of course, that's very easy for us to do. And I guess what I say is closest hero D, let's do it squared as well. Because that way we don't have to do square roots in here, which, you know, are superfluous to a test, because obviously whatever value would be lowest squared is also the same as being the lowest value if it was square rooted. So we don't actually care either way. We just want the lowest one. We don't need to know what the actual length is. So that will allow us to do a length squared. Remember, if you remember from our vectors, we've got our length squared here. I can always compute the length squared of the distance between any two entities. I can just take the two entities' positions and subtract them, right? So I can basically say the test entity P minus my entity P, that's the distance between us, right? And so if I take a look at the distance between us, that will give me the test d squared, the test distance squared. And now I can say if the closest distance squared is actually greater than that, meaning that whatever I've found so far is further away, then this becomes the new best one, right? And so closest hero becomes the test entity. So that just grabs whatever that closest one is of that particular type. And then if I had one, right, if closest hero, you know, entity index, if there actually is something there, I could just say if it's got a high pointer, then what I want to do is I just want to move towards it, right? I just want to move towards it. So it seems logical to me, and I guess I don't actually know, but it seems logical to me that what we should probably do is at that point we could just recycle. I guess I should implement this function as well. Just recycle our function for moving the player to move the familiar, because it should probably move with the exact same rules, I would think, right? Seems pretty straightforward, relatively uncontroversial. So what I need to do here, though, is I need to be able to do this entity high index thing. So let's get a result here, like so. And I've got my high, my low, and my index. So this is the, what did we actually call this? Did we call it low index? I forget. It is called low index. Low index. All right, and so what we need to do here is I need to get the high entity first, because that's actually what we have the index for. So this is high entities, and that's going to be plus the high entity index. I should probably also assert that the high entity index is actually in the range of the high entities. Oops, high entities. There we go. So that we know that we're not out of there. And I guess I could also assert that high entity index, or you know what, I could even just check. I guess I should say if someone asks for the 0, they should just get back the 0, so that they, you know, they don't have to double check. All right, so the low index is then going to be whatever the high says the low index was, right? And the low is going to be just the same exact lookup, the low entities plus the low entity index, right? And so that gets back the full suite, just the way we wanted to before, like so. And again, it's a little wonky. I don't love how much of this extra addressing that we have to be doing. I don't know that it's actually too expensive, but it's unfortunate that we have to do it. And so it might be interesting to start thinking about other things we could do there if it turns out to be a problem for us, right? Again, we'll have to see. Okay, 5-minute warning. We are being warned. That's okay. 5-minute warning seems totally fair. Like I said, this is relatively complicated stuff that we're going to start doing here. So now that we have a move player call, I think what we probably want to do is change this into a move entity call, right? Because there's nothing particularly player-y about it. The only thing that was player-y was the thing where it moves it if it hits the stairs, but I guess that would probably be something that actually happens for everyone, I would guess. Not sure. But so I feel like this is probably something that we could use for everybody. I don't see any real reason why we can't. So I feel like we could just go ahead and make this a move entity call. And so we can go ahead and move the entity in exactly this way. All right, so we can pass the game state, we can pass the entity, and we can pass whatever we want our DDP to be, right? And that's something that we'll have to compute. But that's basically what we'll do. And then we also have to go ahead and change the old call to be move entity. Okay. So let's see. That's game state. And the DDP here, what I want to do is I want to move him in the direction of the hero. So what that would be is the closest hero, right? I'd want to take wherever the closest hero was and subtract my position, which gets me a vector that basically points at the hero. And then I just want to normalize that and factor in some kind of speed, right? So what I want to do is I want to change this to be a vector of length 1, which we talked about how to do that already. We just have to divide by its length. And I guess I already have the length. We have the closest hero d squared here, right? So what I need to do is I need to square root that, right, in order to get the actual length back, and then I would just go ahead and invert it, right? So there's my 1 over. So this is 1 over length, like so, and I'll just multiply that right here, and so that gets me my DDP, right, at unit length. So what I actually need in addition to the unit length is I need the speed here, right? So I need some notion of the meters per second traveled by this guy, meters per second squared, I guess, whatever his acceleration is, right? I guess I could say acceleration, like that. I need a notion of that. I don't know what his acceleration should be. I don't know accelerations very easily, yeah. But hey, look at that. He follows me around. Let's make him a little slower. He's a bit zippy right now. Let's kind of tone that down a little bit. Let's make him sluggish. Seems a little bit better. I don't know. That seems... What's my acceleration? I feel like we maybe have a bug here. Is that right? What did I do? Did I do something wrong? There's the length I want it to be. Here's the length it was. So we're basically multiplying by that ratio. Here's the DDP. Doing 1 over length times the distance between them. Closest hero high P, entity high P. What did I do? Shouldn't he be much? Shouldn't he be much more sluggish than that? Maybe not. So let's find out what the acceleration of the hero is, first of all, just to know what I think. So GDP is one. Oh, duh. Duh. He has exactly the speed of the hero because this player speed was baked into this function. So that's why. Yeah, that's the problem, people. That's the problem right there. So yeah, so basically what I need to do is remove that. So let's go ahead and say to do, pull speed out of move entity. And we'll just say he moves half the speed of the hero, because now basically everything's in terms of hero speed, which is not useful. So now he should get far away from the player and then eventually catch up, like so. And so that's fine, and everyone's fine with that. But what should also happen is if I move, there he goes. If I move far enough away, he should stop, right? And there he does. So the other thing that we need to do is he should always be moved so that his equations of motion still handle, so he doesn't stop right away like that. I don't know why I always close the app. So what we want to do too is we want to have this DDP just be nothing at first, and then it can, if there wasn't someone to follow, at least then he'll still glide. So he'll glide to a stop, right? Instead of stopping abruptly, right? So when I get out of range, he just kind of should taper off a little bit, and instead of stopping totally abruptly. I think that's working. Can't quite tell. I probably should have some slower equations of motion to see if he does or if he doesn't. And so this was also the pathfinding problem. You can see I can get him trapped here, right? And now he can't get to me. And so that was kind of the thing I was saying is like we're probably going to want to start adding some more advanced features so that the monsters and the familiars are smart enough to navigate obstacles on their own, because otherwise the game would be pretty stupid, I would think. All right, so we got some more to-dos to do tomorrow, but for now I think that's totally fine for today's progress. And so let's go ahead and go to the Q&A since it's Q&A time. If you could please prefix your questions with Q:, that would be extremely helpful. Oh, right, the Z. All right, so that's another to-do we have to do. Let's go in here and the push piece call to do Z on alpha. Yes, please prefix your questions with Q:. And if you could keep the things we've done today's stream or on previous streams. If you want to talk about off-topic stuff, that's totally fine, but do it on the pre-stream, so come about 15 minutes before we start. And that's where we talk about random topics, like stuff that doesn't have anything to do with the code we actually wrote. Yeah. Let's take a look. I see no questions. Everyone understood everything. That is how I choose to interpret that. Why Monstar and not Monster? Well, so I believe I actually did call him Monster, but I feel like Monstar is a little more, is like better. Like, like I feel like Monstar would be a better name for this guy. So I would be, because it sounds more, it's like a Monstar. Monstar. Rawr, right? Like that. Like it's very, you can even see the results already. I think you can see that it's way more sort of menacing. Like look at it there. Look at that. Right? It's pretty menacing. If someone rewrites your code using OOP and it runs faster, what would you do? Well, what code are you talking about? Object-oriented versus non-object-oriented has very little to do with like the speed. It's more about like the facility of development. But I'm not sure what you're talking about, I guess would be how I would phrase that. Why do you want to be able to outrun your familiar? Doesn't having to stop for him to catch up get annoying? I just wanted to make sure that that was working. I just wanted to see if there was a search radius thing that would happen there, because eventually that might be a problem. We will play around with that a little bit. But this is not game design, right? We are not designing this game right here. We are implementing features to see how they would work in the engine. And so I wanted to have the concept that as he gets further away, he can't find you, and then when you get closer, he finds you again. And we might play around with that a little bit. I also feel like we should test, because I don't know, you should be able to like pull, I hate the fact that you get started right on top of the guy. I gotta have a way that we separate people when you launch a new character. Like it finds some space for them. But what I was gonna say is, trying to figure out how I could, how could I do that? I guess what I would do is, if you do add player, I guess what I would do is I would say, when you add player, you are actually at the camera P plus some offset. I don't know. World position. I don't know. I'm not going to deal with it now. But point being, it would be nice to be able to add multiple heroes and not have them overlap on top of each other. Could you make the head bob up and down while following the player? Yes, of course. That would be pretty easy to do. Basically what you would need is you just need some notion of what it means to bob up and down. But basically, you know, in your entity, right, you'd have something that was like a T-bob or something like this. There's a couple different ways you could do this, right? But when you add the familiar in there, right, it would set the entity, well, I guess that'll automatically get taken care of when it maps into the high. So what you would do is when you actually go to render it, the bobbing head, I mean, when you update the head, you would then set the Z offset for the head to be, which one is the head? This is the head. To be like a sine wave, you know, on that bob, which I don't actually know if we implemented yet, but it would have to be, you know, something that was basically going to be done in that space. So you'd basically say, all right, I've got some function that bobs up and down like a sine wave, you know, something that goes like this. And I've got some concept of the entity's bobbing rate. And if entity T-bob is greater than, you know, a full circle, so then we'll just go ahead and reset it like that. Of course, I don't know if these get initialized when the high actually does this. Oops, dot high. There we go. I don't know if we actually have a sine function. I guess we do, so that's good. So in theory, we should now be able to make him bob up and down, I think. Now, I don't know if this is in pixel space. This should have been in meters, but I think we actually left it in pixel space. But there he now bobs up and down, right? And you probably want him to bob up and down a little faster than that. So maybe you want something more like this. Well, that might be a little bit too much, right? Let's try that again. Is that what you're looking for, I guess? But yeah, so really all you do there is you just take the Z coordinate and you throw it into some periodic function like a sine wave, and you've got a bobbing head, right? Which is pretty straightforward. There's not a whole lot else to do. And if I got far enough away so that he wouldn't be following me, he'd still just kind of sit there and bob up and down until, you know, you get closer and then he starts to chase you again. Can you write Pong real fast so I can see how to start? I could, I suppose, but I don't think I'm going to. Sorry, I'm not super interested in writing Pong. Monstar would be confused with Monstar, a pointer to a Mon. That's true, but thankfully we don't have any Mons in the game. Are we going to eventually use a component-based entity system? So I feel like there should be an auto ban on the phrase component-based entity system. just because what does it even mean, right? Like, what does component-based entity system mean? Obviously, entities are made up of things. And so the phrase component-based entity system could mean like such a wide variety of things. I don't know. I wish that no one had ever invented that term because it's so non-specific. So I guess what I would say to the question of are we going to eventually use a component-based entity system instead of using an enum of entity types, if not why? That depends very much on how the game code shakes out, right? We will probably have some notion of composable entity pieces, but we may still have the concept of entity types that are used for other purposes, right? And so how that exactly breaks down, it's entirely an issue of compression, right? So it's entirely about seeing where the right trade-offs are to be made, and it has nothing to do with like should you use system X or system Y. All systems are entity component-based systems, basically. Like, I don't even really understand why people make that distinction normally. It seems very arbitrary to me, I guess is what I'd say. Would you think about doing some proportional integral derivative control for familiars to follow? Yeah, if we wanted to make them kind of glide to a stop nearer to you. And I mean, one thing too is that the familiar doesn't stop when he reaches close to you. He kind of bumps into you. He lets the collision system stop him at some point, right? Well, not the collision system, I guess, but yeah, no, he lets the collision system, I guess, stop him. Because he collides with us, but we don't collide with him right now. It's kind of a little wonky, but that's just how it's written, right? And so, yeah, a proportional derivative controller or something similar where he glides to a stop near us would probably be better. But that's not super relevant to us right now because that's more of a feel thing. That's not probably something that affects the way the engine is architected. I wouldn't suspect. But maybe it would be, so we'll have to see. I have a bad feeling about that switch on entity type. Do you think it will probably go away as we get closer to the final architecture? Switches are very good. I would highly recommend not having a bad feeling about them. What I would say is that probably what will happen is we'll become something that's not switching strictly on entity type. It's switching on, like entities will probably be made up of multiple parts that get switched on. Which is hopefully satisfies the people who like the phrase component-based entity system because then they will be able to concretely identify the fact that there are components. But the switch statement will almost certainly remain. It just might not be on an entity type per se. Would collision be an XY only thing, or would you take into account Z as in jumping over another entity? I think we will probably have to handle Z specially because of the nature of 2D games. You can't usually treat Z entirely like a separate coordinate because oftentimes there are special concessions you have to make things work out because of the fact that it's a weird like orthographic perspective and Z is more conceptual than actually physical. So we will certainly take Z into account, but how exactly we take it into account is, it's probably not just going to be, oh, that's awesome. I like what that was just happening there. But it probably will be something that's like a little more, I don't want to say hacky because there's nothing you can really do about it, but it's going to be something that's a little more tweaky, right? It's stuff that we just have to make that makes the game work because we can't do it as if it's real 3D since we don't have full geometry for everything, right? I have the feeling your low entities will be quite big if they have AI and stuff. Won't this be a problem for the huge world? Maybe it would have made sense if you had kept the tile data in chunks so you can deflate some entities just when needed. Well, that is what we're doing, right? The low entities will have to store all of the data that gets remembered, right? And there's no way we can really get around that. We have to store that data. But we only have to store that data. So the low entities can be as small as we want them to be, as small as we can get away with, basically, for the data that has to persist. And high entities store all the rest of it, right? But there's really nothing else we can do. If there's data we have to store, we have to store it, right? Although I guess we could try to do compression on the fly, but I doubt that the entities will ever be big enough to require that. You'd probably still use the memory for it, right? The performance boost off the low-high shuffle, when will we start seeing this come into play? It actually already is. So, for example, we would have gone n squared if we only had one entity type already on a huge number of entities. To give you an example of that, for like right here, all of our familiars would have to loop over all of the entities every time, right? But now they're only looping over the high entities, which is much, much smaller, right? So if you look here, right, it would have been looping over this many, and now it's looping over only this many already. And these will be partitioned probably further, so it'll be even smaller. So we already are getting a performance boost. Could we spawn a ton of these floating head things? I guess. I mean, it seems like we could, I guess. Why not? Why wouldn't we be able to? I guess would be the question. We still don't have a random number generator, unfortunately. So I guess we'd have to just do something like this. But I don't know. No. Yeah. Familiar index equals 0. Familiar index less than 20 plus familiar index. Is this what we're talking about? Familiar offset x. Like so. Offset x. So I guess if I do a mod 5, I actually need a mod 10 minus 5 because I want some to be on the other side of you as well. So all right, so there we go. And I guess that should spawn a bunch of these. In theory. Ooh. Did that find a bug? What happened here? What did we do? Somebody got unhappy when we did that. Change entity location for entity low p. Oh, it started him. Yeah, that's a good point. So there is one other thing we have to do here. So this is a case where we could divide by 0, right? Because we haven't really played around with this much at all. The closest distance to the hero could be 0 if the code, like it shouldn't have ever happened because the familiar shouldn't be able to get right on top of the hero, but in this case, I spawned him right on top of him. So we probably should go ahead and check just to make sure that, you know, it's not, right? Let's make sure that the closest hero distance is something, right? And that should presumably fix that if that actually was what it was. Although it seems like that was not what it was. R in same chunk. A offset is not canonical. So move entity. Yeah, so this is the same problem. I do want to make sure I did actually do this right? And closest hero d squared is greater than 0. Yeah. Move entity DDP. Okay. So let's find out what the problem is here. And also move entity when we're fine with the DDP. Can the DDP ever be 0 here? Do we ever do DDP length and do anything with that? If it's greater than 1, we do it. No. So we don't have any problems there. So let's take a look at why we're getting this problem. First of all, let me make sure that I actually have an easy way to reproduce the problem. So I'm wondering, let's find out, let me just find out. And familiar index y Let me just find out if it is because I'm spawning him on top of the hero. No. Okay, good. So it's just something random. So what actually is the problem that we are having with multiple familiars? I have no idea. If I only add one of them, can I get it to reproduce? Yes. So all I need to do now, I guess, is check that one time when it does move familiar the first time through, and that will cause my problem. So I suppose that's probably good. Camera tile X plus familiar offset. Right. That's the problem. I suppose. Oh, no, it wasn't a problem. Never mind. All right. So now I can go in and find out what's actually wrong. I didn't really want to have to do this in the middle of the Q&A, but I guess I will have to, since I really don't want to leave a bug in there if we've got one. So this means presumably the first time we call update familiar, it will have the bug, I would assume. So let's go ahead and find out why. So we're not actually moving. DDP is set to 0. So we're not actually asking it to update our familiar at all. Let's take a look at where the familiar actually is. The familiar is, well, that's where it is. Let's take a look and see what if that's actually considered canonical. So our world should have what its chunk size in meters is. And so that's the chunk size in meters. So that actually is not canonical. So it looks like it just got created. It looks like we just have a bug. And I guess now that I think about it, we even put a to-do in there, right? I guess we just have a bug in our tile conversion. The function that was like that gets the chunk position from tile position. This guy. I think what we probably want to do is canonical here because I suspect that's what our bug is, right? Oops. And so we're not actually producing valid coordinates when we do this tile mapping, if that makes sense. And does that take an address of? No, what does it take? Is canonical. World v2 offset. Oh, so I guess oh, right, I don't actually have to pass the whole thing. That's sufficient for saying it's canonical, right? So hopefully that'll fire right away. Yes. So it's basically the fact that this thing doesn't actually compute canonical coordinates properly, which I had to do there about this, and we kind of have to think about it. So let's think about it. What we need to do is we need to align our tiles on chunk boundaries. So if I say that I've got an abs tile X, and I subtract from it however many tiles per chunk we actually went. Yeah, so I think what we've got is a problem of just how the alignment is being computed here, right? Again, sorry about this, having to do this right in the middle of the Q&A, but I don't really want to leave a bug in the code. It makes me grumpy. So we've got something where we have tiles, right? And then we want to introduce this concept of a tile chunk. And then we want to be able to pass in to this system a tile index such that we can then compute what its chunk relative offset is, right? And so I guess what I need to do is this is computing it without, this would never produce negative values, right? This is computing it as if the chunks were centered here, and then it's going to compute what the tile index actually was. But that's not what we need to do. What we need to do is, I guess, do that same math, but then say, okay, after we do that, we need to figure out wherever the center of that chunk was, and then go back towards the tile. So thinking it through, if our tiles per chunk is 16, that means that we want to go half the tiles in. We want to basically subtract half of this, right, away. So it wouldn't be abs tile X, right? It would be abs tile X minus tiles per chunk over 2, right? We'd want to basically center around the center of the tile chunk. I think that's right. Again, we should think this through a little bit better, but I'm just trying to fix this so we can continue on with the Q&A, if that makes sense. So let me see if that solves our problem. Yeah. So that was that problem. Yeah. Okay. And so then it looks like I broke the familiar though with our with my check there. Update familiar. Which I'm not really sure why. This, I feel like distance squared should often be higher than that. But I guess it wasn't. Is that too aggressive of a check, or am I missing something obvious? Like, why is that neutering the direction there? What did I miss? Because if I remember correctly, our familiars were working just fine when we were doing this. Oops. When we were doing this. Doing it this way. But then it wasn't working. So I'm very confused. I'm very confused right now. I feel like I've missed something. I've done one of those like typos that I do on the stream, and then I'm like, what is going on? And then it's like, oh, duh, you forgot to do whatever it was. So this should have a check in it, but when I actually added this check, I found that it never would actually execute. So I want to find out why that's actually happening, because that doesn't really make any sense to me, right? Oh, oh dear. I accidentally deleted, I must have hit Control K on that line somehow. Wow, how did that happen? Well, that would explain it. Yikes. That's awful. Man, the perils of editing on stream. All right, well, easy fix. There we go. All right, so now if we want to actually generate more of them, we should be able, now that we've fixed the problem with spawning them in a lot of different places, we should be able to add them in larger quantities. I don't know how many you were thinking you actually wanted, but we could see. So we're still not quite right. So our chunk position from tile still isn't quite right. So let's see why it's not right. Let's take a look at that result. -7, -12. What did I do wrong here? So tiles per chunk is 16, yeah? We actually looked that up at 16. So let's see. Abs tile x, we're taking that and we're dividing by tiles per chunk, we get 0. So if we subtracting tiles per chunk out of that, we would have, 3 minus 8, right? Which would be -5. Why does that not seem reasonable? Right, minus the chunk x tiles per chunk times world tile side in meters. So what does that, why tiles per chunk, that seems totally fair, does it not? What is the issue there? So let's actually walk through this math. So I have my abs tile x is 3. So what does my result chunk x is 0. So that feels like that should be canonical to me. So what did it end up being? So tile side in meters, which is what? Tile side in meters is 1.9. Chunk side in meters should be 2 times, so 16 times that, right? So basically we should have this times 16, oops, times 16, which is what it is. And so if I come up with -5, -5 times the tile side in meters should in no way have given me, okay, so that's what that gave me. And so then the y is the only one that I guess that's wrong. So the abs tile y is the one that appears wrong here. So the abs tile y is -1, and so that's causing a problem because why exactly? So our chunk y is still 0, which is fine. Our abs tile y minus 8 is going to be -9. Oh, okay. Right, because this is a floor. Since I did it, I see what's happening. So since this is essentially doing, this is doing the calculation to find out where you would have been. If it's negative, we actually can't we are trying to find the floor of that. We're trying to find, it should have been in the next chunk over in that case. So this is not really correct, unfortunately, right? Yeah, this is not really correct. Because if the number is negative, then, right, I don't know if this makes sense. So what's going on here, this is not really something I want to do in the Q&A. This is unfortunate, but what are you going to do? Things come up when they come up. So we have our chunks here, right? And there's actually, I guess there's a lot more of the grid lines I'm drawing, but it would still work no matter how many we had. So what we're doing is we're representing the chunks by saying we've got the center and then we've got an offset to wherever the entity is, right? And then we've got this situation where if we wanted to find out where something was, right, let's say that the something is here, we need to first find out which chunk it's in, and then we need to find out what its offset is. Well, when the offset is on this side of the corner, the math I wrote worked just fine, right? But when it's on this side of the corner, it's going to truncate towards here. So it's going to pick this chunk when it does the divide to see which one it's in. It's going to pick this chunk instead of what it should have done, which is picked the other chunk, right? And so what I want to do is I want to have something that's going to correctly bucket this into the chunk that's behind it, right? And so that it works on either side of the 0. So that's kind of annoying, right? But that's where we're at. That is why that is not working. And so I'm not sure what the fastest way to fix that is. I guess the fastest way to fix it... What is the fastest way to fix it? I guess the fastest way to fix it is probably to say, well, let's just do it in float, I guess. Well, then I don't know if that introduces a precision problem. Because it's a little, yeah, it's a little tricky. I'm not sure how to do this quickly. This is something that I'm not particularly good at, these kinds of discrete mathy kinds of things either. So this is exactly the kind of thing that if you need it done in 50 seconds, which is what we would like to have happen here, I'm exactly the wrong guy for that. So unfortunately, I don't know that I'm going to come up with the correct solution. It's probably something actually relatively simple if you just look at it the right way. But of course, I'm not actually sure what that would be. So let me think about this for one more second, see if I can come up with something relatively useful. So if I was to do it, if I was to leave it the way that it was being done before, right, then I know that that does at least give me what the offset is now, right? So what I could do is I could look to see, I suppose I could look to see if it's negative, and then if it is, just bump it up by 1, right? That actually would be pretty easy to do. It seems pretty cheesy, and I don't really know if that works correctly. But right, like if I did abs tile x, yeah, I mean, if I did abs tile x less than 0, result chunk x plus plus, like in theory that works, I guess. I don't know, that seems really janky. So this is definitely not good, but yeah, to do. Think this through on the real stream and actually work out the math. So I don't know if that'll actually work here. That may be awful as well, but we'll see what happens. All right, so which familiar are we adding here? Are we adding the same one? Abs tile x is 3, abs tile y is -1, 0. So, okay. So, oh, yeah, I went the wrong way. Duh. It's minus, it's the previous chunk, not the next chunk in that case. Yeah. So there we go. All right. So that's adding the same. I must have had a typo in there, I feel like familiar offset. Yes, I did. There we go. So now we've got our more familiars. That was way too much work to add a bunch of familiars. A bunch of them are stranded outside the map as well. I guess I can't put them that far. So the Y offset has to be less, but the X offset could be more, I guess. So then we've got kind of a spread. So there are some familiars. I don't know that this was necessarily such a good idea, but there they are. There's a lot of them. And they kind of all will collapse like Daleks into a point, right? Because they're all chasing the same guy. So I feel like that's maybe a little less interesting than it could be. I suppose what I could do is force them to actually collide, right? So I could change the entity to collide when we add the familiars. Right now we're saying that they don't collide with each other. What I could do is say that they actually do, and that might make that a little more interesting, so that when you run it, you know, they can't quite bunch up because they all hit each other, if that makes sense. So they'll be less bunchy, and there they go. And of course that makes a crowd that I can't get through. Like I can't push a familiar yet, so that's a problem. But yeah, we'll see. How will the Z work exactly? I don't know. That's what I was saying. We'll have to see what the game wants from Z. I think really mostly what I want to do is just, you know, allow you to kind of float over things if you're flying or those sorts of stuff. But yeah, I mean, like you brought up with something like looking through a hole in the ground into the lower Z level work, that might be interesting. So it might be something to try. I'm not sure. We'll have to see what we want to do. Z in 2D games is always kind of janky, so we just kind of have to play it by ear and say, what do we want out of our Z, and then go write the code to handle it. That's one of the nice things about doing everything. If you're actually doing a full 3D game, is, you know, a lot of things get more complicated, but one thing gets less complicated, which is you don't have to fake this sort of stuff, right? Will there be a flock system for all the floating heads following the hero? Probably not at the moment, maybe down the line. What kind of pathfinding will be implemented for high entities, and how will they differ from faraway low entities? And will low entity NPCs that are always on the move, really far away, always resolve? It would be interesting to come across a very live world full of history, dead bodies, etc., due to constant AI updating, but would that be feasible? I don't know, but we could try it. Basically, what we have to do for pathfinding for the low entities is something that's very structural, and so we'll have to see how we can, if we can treat our world in a convenient way that allows that to be possible. For high entities, we can do fairly good pathfinding, but for low entities, yeah, it's going to be interesting. How easy would it be to chain multiple bobbly heads to follow each other? Well, really easy, right? Because since they're just looking for something to follow, you could just have them use any hero or any familiar, right? So if you go look at update familiar, you could have it be basically like if high entity index is not equal to my entity high index, right? So it's not me, first of all, and its test entity type is either a hero or it's a familiar. Then, you know, it'll follow it. You know, it'd work, I think, right? So, you know, they all kind of followed each other there, and part of the problem is now they're all kind of just locked up, and I can never be closer than they, you know, they are already as close as they were going to be. So what I'd have to do is introduce something that says like, oh, you know, if it was a hero, then, you know, it gets preferential treatment, or something like this. You know, I don't really know. I could say something like heroes get a bias on them. So for example, something like if test entity low type equals entity type hero, like that. In that case, we bias the test distance squared to be like, you know, half of what it was, or something. I'm just totally making this up. I don't know why I closed the app, but so that the hero can always pull one away, right? The problem is he wouldn't be able to pull two of them away. So yeah, it's just not that useful. Like, we'd probably need to make some logic that tried to, well, you know what? I mean, we could do something even more ridiculous, which is that like you inherit a follow number or something, right? Like you could say something like, you know, the high entity has something that's like how, you know, hero distance or something that's set on it, and heroes always have that hero distance set to 0 or something like this, but a familiar will have it set to whatever it's following +1 or something like this. You know, I'm not going to try to end that. I'm not going to try to do that right now, though. So yeah, so we'd have to do something like that. For now, I think I'll stick with just having it follow the hero, and I think maybe we probably shouldn't have quite as many as we have. So I'm going to go ahead and just keep that to 1 for now, because this seems like a saner. That was what I was trying to do, and I think we maybe had a little too much going on there. We're not ready for that yet. Camera tile y plus offset y, not offset x in add familiar call. Or is there a typo in there? Add familiar. Add familiar. Oh, you mean down here. Oh, that's the one I already corrected. Yeah, okay. So let's see. I was very glad to hear that you deem classes to be basically garbage. I spent too much time in C# trying to learn object interjugglery between them. Oh, well, yes, they are. But that's, yes. Not really a question, but yes. About the chain familiars, could each familiar check if the hero has a familiar already, and if it does, then try to follow the familiar instead? Yes, but it needs to propagate out, so it just needs to increment like a counter and always take the highest counter level, if that makes sense. We could do it. I just didn't. We're already out of time, so I just want we basically just make an integer and we increment it for each guy. We could do it on the next stream. It wouldn't be too bad. All right, I think we've come to the end of the questions. Thankfully, I took up a bunch of time there. All right, so we're a little late today, but that's okay. Better late than never. We had something come up in the middle of the Q&A that was good that we fixed it anyway. Although we didn't really fix it. We still have a to-do there. We gotta actually think this through because that's pretty lame, presumably. Thankfully, this is not really a function we do other than at startup time, but still, I just like to figure out how we should actually think about the tiles and all that other stuff. So anyway, ignoring all of that, let's go ahead and close that down and wrap things up. Okay, so, no, close, there we go. Thank you, everyone, for joining me for another edition of Handmade Hero. It has been a pleasure coding with you, as always. If you would like to continue our little entity trip here of making entities and making them do interesting things, which we're going to have to do, like I said, take several days to kind of just make crazy stuff happen with them, you will want to come back tomorrow at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time when I will be right here doing some more of exactly that. I hope to see you here. I realize this morning it'll be some breakfast coding. So maybe you can't make it, but maybe some folks from Europe can. It's a different time. Sometimes it's a little bit better for them. So anyway, I hope to see you here. But if not, have a fabulous Friday. Anyway, if you would like to follow along with the source code, you can always pre-order the game. And it comes with the source code, which you can download and play around with yourself. You can do that here on handmadehero.org. If you want to support the video series, you can subscribe to our Patreon, which we have with this little handy link here. If you want to follow the brand new, totally amazing, no one can believe how unbelievably awesome it is, Handmade Hero Tweetbot, which tells you what the schedule is every day and what the whole schedule for the week is at the beginning of the week. Ladies and gentlemen, I wrote this by hand. Okay, I wrote it. No, I didn't really. I used like libcurl or something, I think. So I didn't really write it by hand, but I wrote it using web technologies, which is one of those things that I don't really do very often. So it was a little nerve-wracking, but it worked. So anyway, if you want to follow that, you can do that here, and that's an easy way to get the schedule. Finally, if you would like to check out older episodes or learn how to port the series to Mac or Linux, or ask questions on our forums, News and Forums is the place to do it. Please check that out. It's got a lot of good resources in it, and you can post on the forums there too to ask questions if you've got questions outside the stream. So thank you everyone, and I hope to see you tomorrow morning. If not, have a fabulous weekend.